Okay. So now it is my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this July edition. Dr. Biko Agozino is a professor of Sociology and Africana Studies, Virginia Tech, USA. He is ranked as one of the top criminologists in the world today by academicinfluence.com. And he is the author, co-author, and co-editor of some books, including Community Policing in Nigeria, Routledge Handbook on Africana Criminologists, Critical, Creative, and Centered Scholar Activism, the Fourth Dimensionalism of Aguncha Athonwangwo, Adam, Africana Drug-Free Alternative Medicine, Counter-Colonial Criminology, Pan-African Issues in Crime and Justice, and Black Women and the Criminal Justice System. Also, he has directed and produced documentaries such as Shouters and the Control Freak Empire, which was winner of the Best International Short Documentary at the Columbia George Film Festival, USA in 2011. Recently, he was appointed Professor Extraordinarius by the University of South Africa in recognition of his contributions in his field. He has also won some awards, some of which include the Amistad Award from Central Connecticut State University in 2020, and the Award of Excellence in Outreach and International Initiatives by the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences, Virginia Tech in 2021. Colleagues, it is with great pleasure that I welcome Professor Agozino, who will talk to us on the topic, Communal Intellectual Property Rights, Reparative Justice, and the African Origin of Artificial Intelligence. Professor Agozino, it's a pleasure to have you here. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Professor Keke, for the wonderful introduction and for the privilege of being invited to participate in the UP Philosophy Seminar Series. Baye Tepitoli, the capital city of apartheid. Was it by coincidence or by design? Ziwakem Buli asks. So we're talking about design today, the design of thinking, the design of philosophy, the design of artificial intelligence. And I'm sure you are skeptical when I tell you that artificial intelligence originated in Africa. But let us make the case first. Let us state the premise for the conclusion, and then we can see the syllogism and the evidence in support of my hypothesis. But you are welcome to disagree with me, and let us have a debate, a philosophical debate. I hope I have the privilege of hosting so I can share my screen.
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, so let me share my screen with you. And this is the PowerPoint summary of my presentation. It's only 2 slides. Thanks again for inviting me. And here we go, or rather start from here. Slideshow. Okay. Yeah, so those of you who are familiar with the Igbo, my culture, and also the culture of Professor Keke, will notice that I'm placing the roped pots of the Igbo here on the right, but thousands of years before the Igbo made the roped pots, in the 10th century AD, the Egyptians were also making a similar pot. As you can see, the ropes are carved into the stone pot, but this one is a bronze pot. However they made it, I don't know. But how could we go from making such intricate pieces of art before we got into contact with Europeans, to a situation today where we as Nigerians, as Africans, the Igbo, we import everything, including toothpicks, including matchsticks, pens and pencils, even chalks. We don't make anything anymore. Something must have happened in our history to arrest our development. And here is my presentation in one summary. So we talk about Africans making original contributions to artificial intelligence, and some would say to the development of human knowledge in almost every field. This might have sounded arrogant or strange in the past, but more recently, scientists have proven without a shadow of doubt that human life originated in Africa before spreading from Africa to populate the rest of the earth. So we are all Africans, according to recent scientific discoveries. And one of the European thinkers who recognized this earlier than most people was Karl Marx. If you read Das Kapital, you will find hundreds upon hundreds of references to Africans, to the African struggle for the abolition of slavery, and how the European working class and the world working class could learn from that struggle against slavery by enslaved Africans. That is what Das Kapital is about. But also in that book, Marx talked about fractions of surplus value, and the surplus value can be a fraction of 100% when you were enslaved, because those who enslaved you will take 100% of the surplus value that you produce. Whereas if you're a worker, they might pay you, if you are a wage slave, they might pay you a portion of your surplus value as wages, and that can fluctuate. So fractional dimensions is one of the attributes of fractal designs, one of the attributes of artificial intelligence designs, and it is recognized as being more common in African culture than in all other global cultures. Fractional dimensions, that is, Africans do not design or interpret their world in whole numbers, but in fractional dimensions that see us as human beings being part of nature, instead of seeing us as being the ones who dominate and exploit nature the way Europeans would see it. So that's the first, and that, of course, Africans will see all human beings as being part of the same human family. The human race is what Karl Marx would call it. And therefore, we are all brothers and sisters, or fractions of the global human family, contrary to the way the Europeans will see human life as being in hierarchies of domination, with the Europeans at the top. Another feature of fractal designs, or what is known today as African fractals, is recursion. It's a circular process of input and output that goes on infinitely. And you can see that in the End SARS protest in Nigeria, when the rulers, the neo-colonial rulers, imposed dictatorial and oppressive militarized policing the people will rise against it and protest. They make some concessions and one name for the armed police, but then they introduce another name for the armed police, which means that the struggle would continue. As they say in South Africa, la luta continua. So you find it now on the streets of South Africa with a former president jailed because he was held to be in contempt of the courts. And the masses of the people are out on the street protesting. Hundreds of them have been killed by the police paid to protect them. And the question that arises is, why use a punitive approach towards Zuma when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission already established that forgiveness of the unforgivable is a better way to seek justice in Africa? That even though crimes will continue in a secular process, that there will never be a perfect order, that corruption is found in every country of the world. We should not adopt the Eurocentric jurisprudence that obsesses about making the punishment to fit the crime, calibrating the punishment to match the value of the crime committed, which is what Karl Marx called the commodity fetish of capitalism, that even crime and punishment are seen as products in the market, and you got to match the price of the punishment to the value of the crime. Africans for centuries have always preferred reparative justice to punitive justice. So if Zuma stole public funds, well, recover the public funds and forgive Zuma, because jailing him for 15 months will not recover the stolen public funds. If you prove that he stole money, free Zuma and recover the loot. But you can't do it along with Zuma. To do it convincingly with Zuma, you have to recover the stolen land and return it to the rightful owners of the land. You have to recover the apartheid gold and return it to the rightful owners of the gold mines, the people of South Africa. You have to do that not just with Zuma, knowing that apartheid chiefs held the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in contempt, but they were forgiven still. They were not punished. Why are you talking of violence on the streets of South Africa by jailing Comrade Jay-Z? Free Jay-Z, free Jay-Z, free Jay-Z. That's what Africans would say. The masses of the people are saying it. They're saying it because they know that the corporations, rich corporations that commit huge crimes against the people, and the powerful states that commit genocidal crimes against the people are never jailed. There is no such thing as a prison sentence for a genocidal state or for an exploitative corporation. Now we demand that the punitive law should wither away, so that the same principle that is applied to powerful corporations and to the capitalist state would be applied to everybody, including the poor, so that we can use what Derrida called the forgiveness of the unforgivable, something that Western philosophers thought was originated in the religions of the book, the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But he examined those three traditions to find that they did not allow or preach the forgiveness of the unforgivable. They only asked for the things that are forgivable to be forgiven. However, according to Derrida, the forgiveness of the unforgivable is an African tradition. No matter how offensive the crimes committed against Africans, such as 400 years of being hunted like prey and captured to be enslaved for profit. Africans have not been looking for revenge or punishment for those who did those huge crimes against humanity, or the decades of apartheid in South Africa. South Africans are not looking for revenge or punishment for the architects of apartheid, or in my own culture, the Igbo, who suffered 3.1 million people killed in Biafra from 1967 to 1970. The Igbo are not looking for revenge or punishment for the genocidist military generals. They are asking for reparations. Same way that the survivors of apartheid are asking for reparations. And the same way that people of African descent who survived slavery are asking for reparations rather than punitiveness. So I joined the masses of people on the streets in South Africa to say to Ramaphosa, free Comrade Jay-Z, free Comrade Zuma, free him immediately and restore peace as a better alternative. That is the view that Mfo, Desmond and Mfo Tutu expressed in their book, The Book of Forgiving. The Book of Forgiving says that there is nothing that is unforgivable in the African tradition, and there is nobody who doesn't deserve to be forgiven something. And therefore, we should use forgiveness as a better tool for justice than punitiveness. You are welcome to disagree with Desmond Tutu and his daughter, Mfo Tutu. I wonder if the Mfo on our list is the same Mfo Tutu, but it's probably a common name in South Africa. Another principle of African fractals is interconnectivity. And that is what Desmond Tutu would call Ubuntu, the bundle of humanity, that we're interconnected. And I find that this principle of interconnectivity is the one that is not often emphasized by engineers and mathematicians when they talk about fractals or African fractals. But I think it is a key to understanding that those fractional dimensions, those recurring patterns are not isolated, they are interconnected. And this principle is found in the struggle against apartheid, when ANC operatives infiltrated the townships to set up Operation Vula, which you people know about better than I do. But they were using what you might call encryption today to design a way to pass messages by the activists on the ground to the ANC headquarters by typing in something that would then be translated into a voice message or vice versa, and then erased from the computer before apartheid police could catch them. But eventually they were arrested because they may have been betrayed by spies, apartheid spies. Frantz Fanon also talks about this interconnectivity when he talks about this is the voice of Algeria as an alternative radio to Radio Orjaz, which was the French colonial radio broadcast. And the French colonial authorities were trying to block the voice of Algeria, the genuine voice of Algeria, but the masses of the people who were hostile to the radio as a tool of the colonizer would gather secretly to listen to the broadcast of This is the Voice of Algeria. Again, showing the interconnectivity and showing the application of artificial intelligence among people of African descent, even before it became popularly known. Another principle of African fractals is scaling, to show that there are different scales of the color of people in the world, but that doesn't mean that we are all aliens to each other. Some are lighter skin, some are darker skin, but we are all descendants of the original Mother Africa. Before we graduated from there, just as you can look at the coastline and you'll find that it is not a straight line because nature doesn't go in straight lines. And if you look at the foliage of the forests, you will find that each plant has its own fractal patterns in the leaves, and then the leaves of the plant will join other leaves of different plants to form a scaling of leaves across the landscape. That is what makes nature beautiful and makes nature rich. Chinua Achebe expresses it with an Igbo proverb to say that when one thing stands, something else stands beside it. Or in other words, one tree does not make a forest. It has to be a multitude of trees. You also find this principle of scaling in the cornrows that African women have been plaiting into their hair for centuries, for thousands of years, but now becoming popular around the world. And those cornrows, as you can see, are mathematical principles, mathematical designs that can be replicated with computer design in order to teach students of African descent that mathematics is not a foreign concept to Africans, is not a Eurocentric concept. It is a tool or knowledge system developed by Africans, according to even Europeans, and then transmitted from Africa to other parts of the world. So the same thing you can find in groups, being fractions or scaling of different sizes of human interaction. That is a principle of African fractals. Another one is infinity. George Cantor was said to have proclaimed that the knowledge of infinity was transmitted from Africa to the rest of the world. And George Cantor is the one who's credited with designing the Cantor set of infinitely divided lines that can be broken down to smaller lines to infinity. But he said he got that from Southern African people called the Hottentots. The Hottentots, though they were called Bushmen or something like that, were really advanced in mathematics. They counted in threes, but the Europeans said that they could not count more than three, but they actually counted more than three. They were counting in threes to compare who has more cattle, for example. You bring three cows, I bring three cows, and the person who runs out of cows would be said to be the one who has less cows, or who has more glass beads, or who has more silver coins. We count them in threes among the Hottentots. But according to George Cantor, that was a knowledge system transmitted from Africans to Europeans. And that is also confirmed by George Gamow, whose book, 1, 2, 3, ... infinity, again credits the Hottentot as the people among whom the counting to infinity originated and was learned by George Cantor. You're welcome to disagree, but we can go into detail about that. I'm saying this is what George Cantor was quoted as saying, that Africans taught him how to count to infinity. And the clue to the truth of what Cantor said is that people in Europe thought he was crazy, that the mathematics he was developing was not normal. They said, we don't have to worry about that. They're not rational numbers. And because people didn't take him seriously, maybe because people didn't take him seriously, George Cantor went crazy. He died in a mental asylum. That kind of stuff can blow your mind, especially because he was saying to Europeans that the knowledge of this type of mathematics must have been revealed by God to Africans, because nobody taught Africans that type of mathematics. So he was saying to them that Africans are spiritual people who came from God. Europeans didn't think that way. They thought Africans were subhuman. Cantor was saying, no, they are really close to God. And we should recognize that in the way we treat Africans. But then that was at a time that Africa was colonized or enslaved by Europeans. And so they didn't agree with Cantor. Today, they're coming back to it by talking about fractal designs, and African fractals are something more common in Africa than in any other part of the world. Self-similarity is also a principle of fractal designs, and that is something you find a lot in African designs of their houses, of their town architecture, of their belief in the supernatural, of the games that we play, of the textile designs that we wear, almost everything, the musical scores that we play, shows the principle of self-similarity. These principles that I've talked about that are called African fractals suggest to us that Africans made huge contributions to computer or fractal knowledge in computing, or what we might call artificial intelligence. But you might say, well, that's not artificial intelligence, that is the human intelligence. But Diop, Sheikh Anta Diop, would drive the conviction to a logical conclusion by arguing in African origin of civilization and also in civilization of barbarism and an authentic anthropology. That, yeah, the African origin of civilization is a reality, it's not a myth. And he called civilization of barbarism a subtitle, an authentic anthropology, because at the time he was writing, Europeans believed that they originated from angels and that they didn't come from a monkey. Like Africans, they said Africans originated from a monkey according to Charles Darwin, but that Europeans prefer to trace their origin to the angels, to Adam and Eve, who were angelic figures. And when Disraeli, the Prime Minister of Britain, was asked that question in Parliament, whether he believes Darwin, that human beings evolved from apes, Disraeli answered that when it comes to a choice between the ape and the angel as our ancestors, that he and his family will choose the angels, and Charles Darwin was welcome to have the monkeys as the ancestors of his family. Ha, ha, ha. Well, science has shown that Darwin was right, that there is human evolution, well, that originated in Africa for tens of thousands of years, even 100,000 years before human beings migrated to other continents, including Europe, when Africans were developing something like the clock, which you might call the earliest form of artificial intelligence, something that can keep regular time without making mistakes. That's artificial intelligence, the first recorded example of time consciousness about human beings. There was nobody known as a European at that time. Nobody known as a Greek or Roman or English or French or German, no. It was just Africans in ancient Egypt. And the same clock that they designed that has 24 hours in a day is the same chronology that we are using today to record time. Artificial intelligence, the same calendar that they used that had 12 months in a year is the same calendar we are using today. The only difference is that in the ancient African calendar, every month was equal. No month had more days than another month. So they all had 30 days. And then there were 5 days left in a year. At the end of the year, they devoted those 5 years to festivals. But the Europeans came and said, no, some months have to have more days than others to show who's boss, who's the white supremacists. And so they changed the calendar slightly, but it's still the same calendar that was invented by Africans thousands of years before there was any European. So I'm putting it to you that that is the basis of my initial hypothesis that Africans originated artificial intelligence. You are welcome to disagree with me. The question that arises from that premise is, well, did Africans discover this or did they invent it? Isn't it the case that nature is fractal in pattern? just like African fractals, and therefore Africans are merely imitating nature rather than developing rational or intelligent forms of thought through nurture, through education, right? The answer to that question comes from a book called African Fractals by Ron Eglash. And Ron Eglash said, okay, if Africans were simply imitating nature, why didn't Europeans imitate nature? Because nature is also fractal in Europe, and yet they didn't imitate, they preferred Cartesian designs that are straight grids, that are easier to control. Because if there is any riot today in Pretoria or Pitoli, you will be able to control the riot by blocking it off from that street to that street and station police officers to block it off. If there is a fire in any block, you can block it off and the fire department can fight it. But Africans don't design their cities in that way. If you go into the townships, you find that they're not structured in straight grids. It's a fractal scaling of interconnectivity, recursion, fractional dimension that could go on to infinity and in self-similar ways anywhere you find townships in South Africa or the villages, etc., etc. Also, indigenous American natives would be considered to be even closer to nature than Africans, but they did not or do not design their geometric patterns in fractal patterns. Rather, they use Euclidean patterns of, the totem pole, one upon the other, like that. Africans, if they did the same design for masks, for example, you'll find that they would not make it Euclidean, they will make it fractal. Nobody knows exactly why Africans chose to make their designs in fractal patterns. But my hypothesis is that no other group of people have been hunted like prey the way Africans have been hunted for thousands of years, starting with the Arabs across the Sahara for the trans-Sahara trade for about 500 years before the Europeans came and took over across the Atlantic for about another 500 years, including the years of colonialism. Now, if you hunt any other species of animals, say the bald eagle here, or the wildlife in South Africa, as intensely as you hunt or the hunted Africans, those animals would not be building their habitation in easy to control straight grids. They would begin to build their nests higher up in the trees, make their holes more complicated to find, and so on and so forth. And Africans, being human beings, not lower animals, are people who have intelligence, who knew that they were being hunted to extinction, and therefore decided to build their environment in fractal patterns that are difficult to control. It is part of our survival strategy. Today, you find that principle in the design of the internet, that the internet is not designed in straight grids that would be easy to control. Rather, it is called the World Wide Web because it is fractal in design, according to Ron Eglash, who the author of African Fractals, or Bangura, who wrote African Mathematics from Bones to Computers, or Horace Campbell, who wrote about Obama's use of African fractals in the organization of his campaign for the presidency, and Gloria Eme Agwali, that's how I say it, but people say Eme Agwali, which doesn't mean anything in Igbo, but the name is actually Eme Agwali, which means whatever you do, you are accountable to the earth. Gloria Eme Agwali does a similar work on African contributions to science, but she didn't extend it to computer science. And I'm making that extension, following Ron Eglash, Yusuf, Bangura, and Horace Campbell. Asante was cited by Emma Gwali to show that Africans were writing for at least 300 years before the Sumerians started writing on clay. Africans were writing on papyri or papyrus. So Africans invented writing. And you're welcome to disagree with Asante, because George Hegel said that the thing that makes Europeans superior and better than others is because Europeans had writing, whereas Africans have oral traditions. So Mr. Hegel, or Herr Hegel, where did Europeans get the science of writing, or what Derrida called grammatology, from? Because they didn't invent it. Africans were writing for thousands of years before there was even anybody called a European. And therefore, writing cannot be the thing that makes Europeans superior or different from others, according to Derrida in grammatology. Writing is found in every culture in the world. But another thing that Hegel contributed is the idea that in every society, you will have analogies that you could call master-slave relationships, the masters being the ones who are dominant and the slaves being the ones who are dominated, the masters being the ones who struggle for freedom and the slaves being the ones who are satisfied being the servants of the masters. This is strange coming from Hegel, because he developed this concept of master-slave dialectics by studying the Haitian Revolution led by Africans to defeat the French, the Spanish, and the British military invasion and enslavement of Africans. And still he is talking about those Africans as having a slave mentality to serve the masters, whereas the only type of slave mentality that is valid is a revolutionary mentality shown by South Africans in the struggle against apartheid and the struggle to build a more democratic South Africa. That is not a slave mentality, but if it must be called a slave mentality, then it's a revolutionary mentality, because the only thing on the mind of a slave is a toy song. The song played or enacted by South Africans to encourage their revolution against apartheid. Lévi-Strauss, also the French anthropologist, talked about the division between the raw and the cooked as something that is found in every culture, a distinction between men and women, a distinction between good and bad, and so on and so forth. But he made the mistake of saying that something that can be found in every culture is a product of nature, whereas something that differs from culture to culture is a product of nurture. But the challenge for him is that incest taboos are found in every culture, and yet it is not nature that dictated the incest taboo, it is nurture. Because Africans, having been the birthplace of humanity for hundreds of thousands of years before human beings spread to other parts of the world, had already observed that if you do not vary the gene pool in the family, people become inbred and the gene pool becomes weaker. And therefore they encourage exogamy rather than endogamy. Whereas the Europeans were content marrying their cousins, because that way they can keep all the family wealth in the family rather than share with their in-laws from distant families. Sigmund Freud, in his book on the incest taboo, thought that that means Africans are crazy because we enforce the incest taboo so strictly that we avoid our mother-in-law. If you hear your mother-in-law is coming this way, you run the other way because you don't want to confront. It's called the mother-in-law avoidance in Africa, in colonial anthropology. But instead of saying that we were crazy, he could have recognized that we were advanced scientifically in terms of the dangers of incest in the family. Okay, so I don't want to belabor this point, except to note that Rousseau, in his distinction between acoustic and digital designs, actually preferred the acoustic as being closer to nature compared to digital designs. To him, the song of the nightingale is more beautiful than anything that Beethoven or Mozart could have come up with. Africans don't make that kind of distinction. We know that singing by animals, birds, is beautiful, but we also recognize that human talent for songs is also immensely beautiful. We don't make that kind of distinction. And Stewart Hall, then with evidence from South Africa, the struggle against apartheid and the African world, talks about encoding and decoding as something that helps us to understand modern use of advertising. So that if advertisers come today and talk about the value of buying a Mercedes-Benz or wearing gold chains or diamond rings, that is not completely accepted by Africans as the only mark of virtue or value. Africans value human life more than gold, more than diamond, more than Mercedes-Benz. Because Africans are able to decode the messaging in encoded advertisement to prove that we can understand those messages according to revolutionary interest and organizing in our communities, rather than adopt the hegemonic interpretation that was intended by the capitalist corporations that encoded those messages. So this is a critique of the view that the medium massages the message, or the medium determines the message in communication studies. Stewart Hall said it's not true that human beings actually decode, say, the laws of apartheid, saying that Africans were inferior. Africans didn't accept it. Okay, we already talked about Derrida and of grammatology, but also in his book, Plato's Pharmacy, he actually talks about the invention of writing by Africans, according to Plato. In that, Plato quoted Socrates as saying that Africans invented writing as a kind of medicine, but with a warning that you should not overdose on the writing because it could then become a poison, which is something that you might call ethical considerations today in research and writing and interpretation. Same thing that he brought about in his view of Mandela as being admirable, because Mandela was somebody who admired the law, even though he was opposing apartheid. But I think Derrida was mistaken. Mandela was not an admirer of the law per se. Mandela was an admirer of justice, not just law. Okay, so let me go back a little to this master-slave relationship. And Ron Eglash, in a paper in 2007, calls it a broken metaphor that is still used today in the design of computer hardware and software. But he said that the first time this was used was actually in South Africa in 1904 at the Cape Town Observatory, where a designer of a clock in the Cape Town Observatory said that the pendulum swinging from side to side in the clock was the master timekeeper, and the hands of the minute and the hour running around the clock are the slaves. So the master-slave dynamic was introduced to technology in South Africa in 1904, a few years before the emergence of the African National Congress. But today it's still being used until in 2003, a worker in Los Angeles County petitioned against discrimination, to say that the companies that continue to use master-slave terms to identify computer software were discriminating against people of African descent. They were being racist. Why should they continue to use master-slave terms when they could have used in mainframe, secondary frame, branch or leaf, root and branch to describe the same things, right? And so the Office of Affirmative Action agreed with the petitioner and directed that the Los Angeles County will not do business with any software company that continues to use the master-slave terms to describe computer software. The computer designers say, oh no, this is simply identity politics, and we will not change, because these are just terms for for technology. It doesn't make any difference. Well, the struggle continues, because when the Black Lives Matter protests broke out on the streets following the killing of George Floyd, many of those companies reconsidered immediately and changed those terms that they didn't want to change. But the point here is that it wasn't African professors, it wasn't the top universities in the world, it was not the University of Pretoria or the University of Cape Town or Wits, not Oxford or Cambridge, Harvard, MIT, that came up with this opposition to the use of master-slave terms in computer design. It was just a worker in Los Angeles County that should shame us as professors, as philosophers, as researchers, that we're not doing enough as organic intellectuals. We're not paying enough attention to the interests of the masses in our interpretation of philosophy. Okay, so let that sink in. And then if you still have doubts about the origin of algorithms in Africa, you should read Jean-Luc Chambard et al., because in their book, big book, they said it all started in Africa, nowhere else, from pebbles to chips. But when you read an essay by Peter Beers, I think he is affiliated with Harvard University, he talks about fractal revolution in almost every aspect of life and technology, not a single mention of Africa. And then Henry and Milovanovic in their postmodern criminology book talks about chaos as the order of the day, not order, because order is always being established or reimposed to show that chaos is normal, not abnormal. And there is no society where you wouldn't find a degree of chaos. Africans embrace this and recognize it in their social organization and in their designs. But the error of Henry and Milovanovic is that they talked about law-abiding behavior in this pattern here that is called the Mandelbrot set. And they thought that the area in black represented law-breaking tendency, whereas the area in blue, in their book, it is area in white that is in blue, represented law-abiding tendency. And I disagree with them because that is really suspicious use of blackness to represent law-breaking tendency. All right, so in the work of Newton and Descartes, you find mathematics to be something that is obsessed with domination, which part of the equation is above, which part is below, etc., etc. But Derek Bell, in Faces at the Bottom of the Well, uses critical race theory to prove to us that we have interest convergence. Instead of looking for who is dominant, who is superior, who is the best. Why don't we look for our common interests? Because human beings, as Ubuntu would suggest, are people who share interest in living a satisfactory, happy life with their fellow human beings. So those states in America, more than 18 states that are banning the teaching of critical race theory are ignorant. They do not know that critical race theory is not only about race, it's also about gender. Of course, it's also about class. Critical race theory came about because Europeans had been teaching critical legal studies with emphasis on class differentials that determine the outcome in law cases. But they didn't mention race, which is surprising because critical legal studies emerged from the Frankfurt School in Germany, which should have been sensitive to racism, given the history of Nazism in Germany. But we are blind to it, maybe because they were white men. African Americans, we are the first to identify that it's not just class, it's also racism that determines outcomes in the courts. So they designed the theory of intersectionality to say that Black women, for example, do not experience their poverty only when they go to court. They also experience racism when they go to court, and they also experience sexism when they go to court. So we as scholars, philosophers, should understand that those three major systems of social relation are not separate. Even though they are different, they are intersected, or as Stewart Hall would put it, with a study of apartheid or poor, low wages under apartheid. They are not separate, they are articulated, they are disarticulated, and they are re-articulated for the purpose of understanding social relations in any society, including Thatcherite Britain. Under Thatcherism, it was not just racism that was a problem, it was also the fact that class and sexism were built into the ideology of Thatcherism. Stewart Hall actually developed this theory of articulation 9 years before the theory of intersectionality, or CRT, was developed in the US. He actually used the word intersect in the theory of articulation in 1980, before intersectionality emerged in the US. So in other words, the protests, the liberation struggles are designed to level decentralization, to lead to devolution of power, to the flattening of hierarchies, so that Black Lives Matter is not one hierarchical organization that runs everything. Obama's campaign for the presidency was not simply the type of campaign that Donald Trump would run as a personal project. It was decentralized, it was devolved, it flattened power hierarchies. Same with the US revolt against British colonialism. It was not really centralized, it was decentralized, it was devolved, and hierarchies were flattened to some extent, to the extent that the first person to die in the US revolution against British colonialism was an African, Crispus Attucks. And actually that fight was started not by adults, but by children throwing snowballs at the marching British soldiers. So they're now called Minutemen, but I said, no, it's not Minutemen, it is minute men. But they laugh at me and say, poor African, you don't understand. They're called Minutemen. I said, no, it's not Minutemen, it is minute men, the little guys, the children who started fighting the British soldiers by throwing snowballs at them, and the British soldiers started throwing back and chasing the children, then their parents came out. That was how the American Revolution started. So Mandelbrot is recognized as the father of fractal. He ain't the father. He's not even the grandson. Africans had been doing this stuff before Mike Mandelbrot came along. But to his credit, he uses the picture of a village from Tanzania to show how fractal the designs of African villages are. But he looked at the patterns of trees, plants, rivers, clouds, and the stock market to say that they're not in straight lines. This is the Mandelbrot set. They are in fractal designs. That is today known as African fractals. And in the book by Claudia Zaslavsky, Africa Counts, she talks about African contributions to mathematics and quotes Chinua Achebe as showing us in the arrow of God how Africans counted. But she made the mistake of thinking that the Igbo count only in 6, that the highest count is 6, simply because Achebe said that there were 6 cowrie bags, and in each bag there were 6 cowrie shells. That's simply because there are 6 people, likely because there are 6 people who are going to share those cowries, and according to the Igbo, the shares have to be equal because all heads are equal among the Igbo. Nobody got 2 heads. Everybody is equal, so you can't cheat anybody by giving them 5 cowries and giving 7 to another person because they're a chief. The Igbo know no king. We count to 100. We count beyond 100. And when it is infinite, we say no, or numerous, really, just the way the Hottentot would say it. So I already mentioned Horace Campbell on Obama's organizing. If you read this literature, you'll find the Dogon and the Chokwe in Angola using deep mathematical principles to design the games they play on the sun. Abdul Bangura also talks about this in African mathematics, from bones to computers, and talks about the African origins. Because a lot of people still think, okay, maybe Africans do it, but how can we prove that it originated in Africa? But here, Ron Eglash again says, yeah, it originated in Africa and it spread through diffusion. So he actually looked at that question of origin and he said, yeah, it's Africa, no doubt about it. Africans developed conscious application of fractal geometry. They have a history of base 2 calculation, which began with African divination and was then spread to the rest of Europe through geomancy, through the Freemasons. They were studying African systems of divination. That was what George Cantor was doing. And that was why some people thought he was crazy. But that stuff spread from Africa, and that is the argument of Jean-Luc Chambers in A History of Algorithms. Another Eme Agwali, Philip Eme Agwali, the more famous of the Eme Agwalis, is noted, or was noted by Bill Clinton as a father, one of the fathers of the modern internet. Because before Eme Agwali came along, the design of computer interconnectivity was done with what they call bifurcations, so that there is always 2 nodes at every end of a bifurcation, and those 2 nodes would lead to 2 other bifurcations each. That was how they tried to connect computers around the world. But that was wasteful and slow in internet connectivity. Philip Eme Agwali, another Igbo like me, came along and said, from his observation of his mother's kitchen, this type of dichotomous bifurcation in internet connectivity is wasteful. See, among the Igbo, a kitchen is made up of 3 stones, not 2. Because if you try to balance your pot on 2 stones, chances are it will tip over and you waste your food. So the Igbo women would use 3 big rocks to balance the pot and then put firewood from the 3 angles to cook a meal. So he simply added the third dimension to the bifurcation, and you might want to call it the trifurcation. The trifurcation. So with that, immediately, computer internet connectivity became faster and led to what is known as the supercomputer and parallel processing in computer engineering. He won a prize for it, but no royalties for the use of his knowledge, his algorithm to design the internet or make for faster computer connectivity, maybe even to 5G that we are welcoming today. And some people might say, okay, maybe Philip made a mistake of applying his faster computer connectivity to petrocarbon drilling, because that is a dirty technology that is contributing to global warming. But in fairness to Emeagwali, petroleum drilling was very wasteful when he came along. They were wasting about 80% of the petroleum that they drilled because they didn't know how to capture them. They were just using them to pollute the environment where farmers couldn't grow food and fishermen couldn't catch fish because of the pollution. So his design helped the oil companies to reduce that type of pollution by capturing about 80% of the oil that they drill instead of only 20%. So that is still being used in the oil industry today to drill, but nobody's paying Philip Emeagwali any royalties for his inventions. And finally today, or before the finally, let me conclude by referring to the work of Blake, who had written a book about kiosks in the 1980s, 1987, I believe, but didn't mention Africans at all because he did not know that kiosk theory was an original African contribution to knowledge. The Europeans think kiosk was a bad thing, something to be abolished. The Africans embraced it as a force of nature and used it to design their environment. But now writing again about the history of information technology, Blake says that that stuff started among Africans because Africans used the drum or the talking drum to communicate messages for miles and miles through relays. Some drummer here will hear the message that a big chief had died in a different village and relay to the next village using the talking drum. They also used the talking drum to organize rebellion against slavery to such an extent that the enslavers banned the use of drumming by the enslaved. It was a crime to drum. Just like apartheid banned a lot of African musicians during apartheid because they knew that the Mama Africa was getting to us when she was singing Malaika. She was singing about Africa as a spouse that she would like to marry, etc., etc. She knew that, I mean, the apartheid regime knew that that was revolutionary. Same thing with the treatment of Nzua Kembuli, the people's poet, maybe even to the killing of Lucky Dube, that is suspicious because the thieves didn't steal anything from his car, saying that they didn't know he was Lucky. How can't you know he was Lucky? Everybody knew Lucky. And then Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates at Harvard University reminds us that the internet today is the modern African talking drum. And maybe he's right, because if you hear me typing, it sounds like I'm drumming because I never learned touch typing, so I drum on my keyboard. But the point he's making is that even though Africans contributed to the development of the internet, etc., that because of the inequalities found in capitalism, access to the internet is really unequally distributed, and Africans are increasingly excluded from the information highway maybe what he's saying is to African families, we can correct this by teaching our children mathematics from early on and helping them to master mathematics, have no fear of mathematics, and therefore be more comfortable applying mathematical principles in their designs. And maybe before we buy a big screen television for our homes, we should buy a laptop computer for the kids to use. And maybe have a bookshelf in every home rather than have only Nigerian Nollywood movies, mountains of it, that the children watch night and day and do not study, and therefore they're doing poorly in mathematics and English. Not because they are not clever, but because they're not practicing the same way that our soccer teams practice every day, our basketball teams practice every day, our cricket teams practice every day in order to get better. That is how our children should use the principle of recursion in their practices, use interconnectivity to apply the knowledge, scaling, and study to infinity, and have self-similar results. Finally, of course, roads must fall, but also fees must fall. In South Africa and across Africa, we should have a system that recognizes the deprivation that Africans endured under apartheid, colonialism, and slavery when teaching, learning, reading, and writing was forbidden by law against people of African descent. So we should recognize that by applying reparative justice to the communal intellectual properties that Africans have given to the world, all those big computer firms should recognize this and set aside a portion of their profits to develop coding academies and software companies owned and controlled by Africans across Africa. They're doing this in Asia, in China, in India. Why aren't they doing it in Africa? It's simply because they are racist. They are still thinking about in terms of master-slave relationships. But we do deserve, even though the laws of intellectual property is designed to favor individual inventors, Africans have always favored communal inventions and development. That doesn't mean we shouldn't get a penny from our contributions to human knowledge, to artificial intelligence. We should be given a portion of the profits to help us to develop our schools, our own technology, so that the technologies do not end up being another tool for the domination and control of Africans by spies. We should develop our own people's technology the same way that the African National Congress used Operation Vula to design something that you might call encryption, the same way that women in Nigeria are using encrypted messages to spread the struggle against SARS and other systems of oppression without being discovered by the police. Thank you. I'll end here for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Biko Agozino. That was wonderful. I believe we have all been provoked well enough to engage in the debate. The talk has eminently lived up to the expectation and billing of the University of Pretoria Philosophy Seminar Series, which focuses on generation of ideas through deep thinking that would provoke thoughts amongst scholars. And you've really raised a lot of issues here, and I believe that the audience took note and will very soon be asking you questions and making comments as the case may be. From the African origin of fractal designs, that one it's not so debatable, to the more controversial ones that has to do with some modern ideas in the internet connectivity, and a whole lot of issues in mathematical thinking and algorithms and geometry and what have you. That sets the stage for a more, what would be a very enriching, I suppose, discussion to take place. So before I open up the microphone, may I remind us that we can chat our questions. We can also use the hand-raising icon below the list of participants to indicate that we've got a question or a comment to make. I would implore us to keep our questions brief, our questions and comments brief, so that as many people as possible would have the opportunity to air their own views and ask their own questions and engage in the debate to follow within the time that we have left. Thank you once again, Professor Agozino, for that wonderful talk. I will now open the floor for the conversations to begin. And I can see a hand raised by Patrick Ben. Patrick, kindly unmute yourself, go straight to your question, or if you've got a comment, keep it brief. Thank you very much. And let us all remember to use respectful professional language in our conversations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Prof, for the presentation. I have two things. First is a comment, and then the second one is a question. The first comment is regarding your assertion that with regards to Nigeria, for example, during the Biafran War, that 3.1 million Igbos were killed. I don't think it is very kind to history. I've seen many intellectuals refer to it as Igbos, Igbos, Igbos. The people that constituted the olden region of Nigeria, the old eastern region, were made up of over 250 different dialects and ethnic groups and all that. So referring to all of them as Igbo is not very kind to all other people who occupied that ethnic region and also were killed by the Nigerian forces. So that assertion is not very much in order. Then secondly, to the question of why Zuma or people, the African notion of forgiveness is something that should be adopted and is very nice. I think the reason why the continent is the way it is because most people, when they leave power after corruption and, you know, creating a dysfunctional system, know that there is no punishment for their crime. So if we say people should be forgiven simply without any form of deterrence, what don't you think that will incentivize more people to loot and keep stealing and destroying the continent? In the absence of deterrence, how do you incentivize people to be of good behavior by just simply forgiving them when we know there are people who are hardcore criminals themselves and will never stop being criminals if they are not stopped? Thank you.
Tough questions, Ben, Patrick, and thank you for those questions. You are right. Biafra was not only Igbo. There were other ethnic groups in Biafra that were also oppressed and killed in large numbers by the genocidist neo-colonial regime imposed on Nigeria by Britain and armed, trained by Britain for the purpose of genocidal domination of the country. But the point I was making is that the victims of Biafra were mainly Igbo. Of course, other people also died, but the vast majority of those who were killed were Igbo. And the ethnic groups that you mentioned, the minority ethnic groups in the Southeast, joined forces with the federal troops to hunt down and kill the Igbo. This is not something I'm making up. It is something that even Igbo people in that region, Elechi Amadi, confessed in his book, Sunset at Dawn, that he joined the federal troops as a colonel and led them to the hideouts of the Igbo soldiers so that they could be massacred. The books written by Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was also an ally of the genocidist federal troops that eventually hanged him, didn't say anything about the Igbo killing minority ethnic groups in that region. He said the Igbo troops were looking for food and harassing some villagers to get food, which is what soldiers do. They commandeer food wherever they could find it in a time of war. And Isaac Barrow, in his own revolution, a diary of the 12-day revolution, never talked about Igbo killing the Ijaw. On the contrary, he said that he arrested an Igbo woman who came to buy ogogoro or local gin for sale in Igbo land. And he arrested her because the gin was considered to be part of their natural resources that they did not want Igbo to touch. So they drank up all his gin. And maybe while they were drunk and asleep, the woman escaped with her life. But it wasn't the Igbo who killed Isaac Barrow. It was his comrades in the genocidist federal troops that killed him. It wasn't the Igbo that killed Sarawiwa. It was the genocidist military that he supported that hanged him 6 times before he died. And of course, the second in command in Biafra was not Igbo, it was Ibibio or Anang, Philip Effiong, etc., etc. So you are right, it wasn't only the Igbo that died, but it was mainly the Igbo. So if you include the others who were killed in that genocide, maybe the figure will come closer to 5 million, which is a figure that is quoted by Nnamdi Kanu, the leader of the indigenous peoples of Biafra, who is now held in detention in Nigeria by the dictatorial regime simply because he's calling for a referendum. A call for a referendum is not a crime. He should be allowed to campaign for his referendum the same way that people in California have been campaigning non-violently for a referendum forever. Texas has been doing that. And of course, Scotland has voted twice in the 1970s and more recently for a referendum on independence that they both lost. And then of course, Britain voted for Brexit, even though Scotland voted to remain in Europe. So those kinds of campaigns are democratic. They're not a reason to go to Kenya and they kidnapped a Nigerian British passport holder and rendition him to detention and torture in Nigeria simply for calling for a referendum. That should not be supported. They should free Nnamdi Kanu and use reparative justice to correct the huge crime. 3.1 million or 5 million is a lot of people killed by fellow Africans with arms supplied by the British Labour Party government in the UK and by the Soviet Union. It should not be tolerated by Africans, never again. Anyway, and so coming to Zuma, you say if we do not punish, then the crimes will continue. Well, the crimes will likely continue all over the world, but we know that punishment is a poor response to crime. The Europeans believe in the Nuremberg principles of war crimes, but the Nuremberg trials were simply selective. They only tried a few people as an example to the rest of the world. The vast majority of the people who committed the Jewish Holocaust were never punished by the Nuremberg principles of justice. And the contrast is Gacaca in Rwanda, that the majority of the people who committed the Rwanda genocide cannot be punished. How do you punish millions of people who may have participated in the Rwanda genocide if you want to make the punishment to feed the crime? You would have to hang millions of people, but that would be another genocide. The Igbo are not looking for that. And so in the case of Zuma, I agree with you, deterrence has to be put in place. But Zuma is not afraid of going to jail, you know. He's a freedom fighter. He knows that going to jail is a trade risk involved in being a revolutionary fight. So he may have made mistakes in office, which would be punished by the neo-colonial state by giving him a prison sentence. He's not afraid of that. The thing that Zuma will fear most is if you seize his wealth. Cyril Ramaphosa's company was involved in the killing of 36 miners in Marikana. If we seize all his wealth as punishment for the involvement of his company in the kill in Marikana, he'll be really pissed off right? The apartheid chiefs still hold their shares and wealth in Anglo-American mining company, right? Well, let's seize all their profits and give them back to the rightful owners of the land. That is what they are most scared about. They're not afraid of going to jail, but of course, you know, they will never go to jail. There is no prison sentence for a company engaged in killing lots of mine workers, or for a government engaged in genocidal killings. Excuse me. Rather, they are never punished, really. But what I'm calling for is called reparative justice. So we're not calling for those countries that benefited from slavery to be jailed. We're calling for them to give back to the survivors. We're calling on the Nigerian government to pay reparations to the survivors of the Biafra genocide. We are calling on apartheid or New South Africa to recognize the crimes of apartheid South Africa by paying reparations to the survivors. They shouldn't continue to live in those squalid townships. Up till now, Joe Slovo started rebuilding modern houses to be handed out to people living in the townships. By now, it should have been completed by the ANC in power. What happened? Same thing in Namibia. The Germans have finally apologized and are offering a paltry $1.3 billion in development funding, but without any reparations to the Nama and the Hiroro, who were almost completely wiped out. So that's a beginning, but more should be done. And I think Britain agreed in 2003 or 2013 to pay some reparations to the survivors of the Mau Mau uprising. We should continue to press for such reparations for the whole of Africa, from the Europeans who benefited from the slavery and colonization of our people. Not punishment, but reparative justice works better than punitive justice. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ben, for those questions, and thank you for your responses, Professor Agozino. I think for us to save time and accommodate more people before our time is up, I'd like us to take 2 questions, and then Professor Agozino would respond briefly. The first question will come from Zanda, and thereafter Arabia will ask his own question. Professor Agozino, please, you may wish to make note as the question. Zanda, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Okeke, and thanks very much, Professor Agozino. Maybe I should take the prompt from what was just discussed about, it's also a question about reparative justice. So I completely acknowledge the inherent worth of studying history and studying the history of Africa and of African civilization. My question, I suppose, is a Fanonian question, that when we study African history in, as your title says, the reparative justice and the African origin of AI, when we study the African origin of AI or any other sort of ancient African history, we're doing much more than just studying history for the sake of studying history. This is a reparative exercise. This is a sort of a political or a liberatory exercise. But the accusation that Fanon levels against people like Cheikh Anta Diop, Negritude, Black consciousness, etc., is that this is really sort of a middle-class exercise, so that lots of scholars have built very cushy careers around unearthing the history of Africa. But when it comes to liberatory action, how does this help the people that are alive today? So how is this not a middle-class action when we just rediscover African fractals, or when we you know, change the master-slave terminology in computers? How does that help the 4 million people that were evicted after 1994, a much greater displacement of Black Africans than happened under apartheid or under colonialism? How does that help people who are being evicted by their tribal chiefs or the Zulu king? you know, so how do we make history really liberatory? How is this regaining of an original African worthiness helpful to Africans living today?
Okay, thank you. Zanda, Arabia, please be brief.
Yeah, thank you very much. All right, thank you very much, Prof, for your question. My question deals with the huge leap you appear to make between, say, the traditional pre-colonial, for instance, African hairdresser who knows about fractals, or architectural designer who knows about fractals, and then in one hand, and then on the other hand, AI designers or designers of artificial intelligence systems. You know, there seems to be a huge leap there, and I don't think you've been able to provide sufficient reason to connect one with the other. You know, there seems to be an obsession of some sort with the custodianship of knowledge, where it is either the West originated X, or it was Africa that originated X, and therefore Africa must be. So when you claim that Africa should be, there should be some reparations given back to Africa for coming up with fractals or discovering fractals, when you've not sufficiently shown the link between traditional African mathematics and AI today as we know it, it becomes problematic for me to see why such reparations should be made. And even if that link was sufficiently proven, there is still no, I don't see any reason why such reparations should be made. So for instance, it is almost the same thing as saying that because Fela Kuti invented Afrobeat, therefore every other person in the future who uses Afrobeat or some version of Afrobeat must pay reparations to him. I do not immediately see the link. Perhaps you can help me out.
Okay, Thank you very much, Arabia. And Professor Agozino, please permit me to read out one question that is in the chat box so that you can attempt the three questions together. All right, the question is from Benjamin, who says, you talked about how the Western model of punitive justice is based on the commodity fetish, giving a price to a crime and asking for punishment worth that price. I am wondering how reparative justice could get around this problem to determine the amount of reparation that needs to be done to realize justice. Okay, so over to you, Professor Agozino.
Thank you, Professor Keke. The question by Zander and the question by Benjamin are similar. So let me address them first. And my answer to that question is to say that justice is never complete. It's usually fractional, it's usually recursive, it's usually fractal in its appearance and design, but every little justice goes a long way. You may never completely repair the damages done to Africa by 400 years of enslavement by Europeans. You may never completely repair the damage done to South Africa by decades of apartheid at the hands of Europeans. But you can do something towards repairing the damage. When you repair your roof or repair your car, it's never really a brand new car or brand new roof, but it works a little better than it was before you repair it. That is what reparative justice aims to do. It's not the same as restorative justice, because you may never be able to restore to Africans what they had before they were almost completely destroyed. So that is the Fanonian thesis, actually, in The Wretched of the Earth. The conclusion to the part on concerning violence is a section on concerning international violence. And there, Fanon called for reparations because the wealth that smothers Europe, according to Fanon, comes from Africa. And therefore, we deserve reparations as a matter of right, not as a sisters of charity kind of band-aid towards Africa. So it can be done by the corporations, because reparations is not always punitive. Sometimes it is something that you do to somebody or group that you have offended. You try to give something back, even if the courts did not order you to do so. So nothing stops Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and Apple Computer or Google and Yahoo, or all the internet giants from coming together to say a portion of our profits will be held in trust for people of African descent to fund education at all levels, free of any tuition fees across Africa, as part of our contribution to reparative justice. Because the rare earth matter that powers all these internet hardwares comes from Africa. And for decades, millions of people have been killed in the Congo over the wars on who's going to control those metals that are being used by the internet companies to make huge profits today. Nothing stops them from coming together to say, yeah, we're going to give something back to Africa. The strange thing is that we're not asking for it. If it was Europeans or Asians, they'll be demanding for this kind of reparative justice that I'm calling. Answer to the second question is not, there's nothing wrong with a leap forward. That was actually the error in Hegel, because he said dialectics have to come gradually through evolution. But Lenin said, how about a leap? Leap. Because sometimes you don't have to wait for gradual evolution. You put an R to the beginning of that evolution and it becomes a revolution. So you can leap forward. You can leap from a feudal Europe to a revolutionary socialist Europe. The Russians attempted to do that. The Chinese attempted to do that. And Africa can certainly do something similar by abolishing all those colonial chiefs that were imposed on us, abolish them overnight. We don't have any chiefs in Africa. We don't have any kingdoms. We have republics. And therefore the people should elect their mayors and town councils and have nothing to do with anybody who claims to be a chief. It will be a crime to go around parading yourself as a chief. We're gonna come and seize all those, your cattle, and give it back to the people. If you ever call yourself a chief in Africa, that is what the Chinese did. That is helping them to leap forward. They are leaping forward because they don't have any chiefs. That's what the Russians did. They're leaping forward because they abolished the feudal institutions that were holding them back overnight. And that is what actually Lenin calls for in State and Revolution, that the capitalist state will have to be abolished overnight, but it will be succeeded by a worker state. And the worker state, therefore, will have to wither away along with the criminal law. The law will wither away because in the future, we will not be using punitive justice. We will be using administrative justice so that we can give to all according to their abilities and take from all, give to all according to their needs and take from all according to their abilities. That is not punishment. So that is the way we're going to prevent anybody wanting to steal a lot of money from us in the future. We're just going to seize the money. Right, we seize it, because that's what they're afraid of. The reparative justice of taking back what you stole and giving it to the people in the form of educational funding, funding of healthcare for free for everybody, funding of roads and infrastructure development, and of course, funding business startups that are owned cooperatively by the people. That is how we're going to build in houses and distributing them among the people. That is how we're going to enforce reparative justice, even though it will never promise to be a commodity fetish that gives back to the people exactly what they, but giving something back wouldn't hurt. And Yes, let us all attend and let us demand it. Let us stop obsessing with punitive justice because it doesn't really do much good to the people who are victimized. Thank you.
Okay. I think our time is fast spent and we wouldn't be able to take more questions. I can see some people indicating that they still have questions. Perhaps you can all take it up privately with Professor Agozino after this session. Thank you once again, everyone. I must thank you on behalf of the Department of Philosophy, University of Pretoria, Professor Biko Agozino, for that very challenging and provocative talk that you have presented today. And I believe that the conversation will continue. And some persons who have attended this talk may have been inspired to write some essays on some treatises to deepen research in some other directions. Thank you very much. Professor Agozino is a criminologist, world-renowned, and a social thinker par excellence. And we are happy to have hosted him today. And thank you, all of you that were able to join us from different parts of the world. We hope that you'd be able to follow us when we announce the next presenter in this series. And if you are interested in presenting in this series, just send us 200-word abstract that speaks to the thesis of your talk. It has to be original. It has to engage with very deep, controversial issues that will provoke thoughts in order to extend the frontiers of knowledge. Thank you once again, every one of you, for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, and bye-bye.